Hey everyone, welcome Fight Side listeners, welcome fight fans, and everyone who listens, who may be listening to this for the first time. I am Iggy, also known as Tumen. This is my actual name. I am the host of Tengridome, the podcast that is being published on the Fight Side Podcast Network, and this is another one of those, another one in the series of discussion panels that we have recorded for the Fight Side that have to do with like broader institutional topics, things like you may have heard, may have listened to the previous episodes, which have to do with defining toughness in combat sports, and the strength and conditioning podcast with Zach Makovsky and his and other guests. And so without really going into too much detail, I'm just going to let everyone introduce themselves. So I'm just going in the order that is on my screen right now. So Zach, once again, please introduce yourself to any newer listeners that may not know you and may not know the Fight Side's work, although they really should have acquainted themselves with all that.
Yeah, Zach Makovsky, been fighting professionally for just about 15 years. Now starting to get into coaching a bit as well. And, I've never fought amateur MMA, so I don't know how much I can offer to this podcast, but I have cornered a lot of people in amateur MMA, watched other fighters come up through the system. I competed in wrestling as an amateur, obviously, in college. And now I also on occasion contribute to the Fight Site, so that's that.
Yeah, to your point about what you can contribute, the idea is to contrast of obviously the amateur experience and the pro experience, so we're very much looking forward to your input.
That's why I brought on Mr. Torres, because
yeah, exactly.
He's got a lot of experience in this area.
Today's guest of honor, Mr. Torres, please introduce yourself.
I am the guest of honor. My name is Jose Shorty Torres. Been professional for almost about 6 years now, which is crazy to think about. I've been training since I was 4 years old, so I had a lot of amateur experience. MMA when I was 18, I had about 26 amateur MMA fights. I had about 50 plus in kickboxing, Muay Thai, and then hundreds in amateur wrestling in high school and in college. So when it comes to the amateur realm, that is my forte. I've kind of tried to be the pioneer of amateur MMA, at least in the States, and being a two-time IMMAF world champ, which is the amateur world championships. It's a huge thing, and I am the other contrast. I'm the yin, while Zach is the yang.
Well, I'm sure we're going to see more interplay between you two today, more banter. So, Trey, please go ahead.
I'm Treyvon Coker. I also, I guess I'm a Fight Site contributor now, basically, on a few podcasts. But no, I am an amateur fighter myself, so this is actually really good because I don't have any experience as pros or anything of that sort. I've had some amateur fights, so I could probably speak upon that in that specific realm.
Excellent. Yeah, great. That's exactly why we brought you on. And our last guest, also a guest of honor. None of these guests are not guests of honor, I have to point out. So, Dan, go ahead.
Well, it's an honor for me to be on on the podcast again with you, my man Tumen, and of course Zach and Jose and Treyvon, who I just recently met. So it's a pleasure. Hopefully, I can contribute to it again. I only fought, scheduled to fight amateur twice, and the second one was kind of how I ended up working in the media side of things. But aside from getting my butt kicked for 3 rounds by Marvin Eastman's son, I'll see what I can contribute as far as filling in the proverbial holes. Don't giggle, Tumen.
Too late. Too late. Well, this is exactly why we decided to bring Dan Tom on to talk about holes and filling in other holes and all that stuff. So, to those listeners who do not know, Dan Tom is the host of the Protect Your Neck podcast, and he also writes for MMAJunkie.com. So, very merited, credentialed individual in the world of MMA media. Yeah, do the gesture.
Yeah, Brian Wagner is going to get me again for that. You know it. So I got to be careful.
Of course,
Thank
naturally.
you. Appreciate that.
So yeah, quick disclaimer, it's the first time I'm actually hosting a discussion panel. I'm more used to one-on-one dialogues and podcasting. So if I mess anything up, I already have a built-in excuse. Please lay off my case. It's also 3 a.m. So, all right, anyway, enough arsing around. Today's topic, the topic for today's discussion is going to be amateur MMA, its current state and its future development. We're going to go over the things that just kind of any problems that might be inherent in the way amateur MMA is set up, any potential avenues for development, experience working and fighting in amateur MMA, working with amateur fighters, all that stuff. That's why we have today's, that's why we brought together this panel. So, so I guess we'll start with you, Jose. Please just let's go over the governing bodies that control and regulate amateur MMA today. What do you think about them? What sort of experience you have working with them? Any like notable things you'd like to point out? Maybe some things you'd like to change. Just a quick overview.
Yeah, at least when I went amateur, there was still, legalization of knees and elbows to the face. So amateur MMA has been adapting very much so, and at least when I turned pro and obviously till now, you have guys, and obviously every state is very, very different. All 50 states have different regulations. So some make you wear headgears during fights as amateurs. Some make you wear shin guards during fights. Some states don't. Some use the 7-ounce MMA gloves. Some use the regular 4-ounce professional style MMA gloves. So every state is different. Every commission is, run differently. But when it comes to the worldwide organization, at least the one I represent is the IMMAF. There's another one that's obviously growing called Gamma that ONE FC supports. IMMAF is the one that I went through, and we had a national tournament. While other countries had national tournaments as well, we were able to compete for the world championship. And honestly, those are pro-level guys, the amateur ranks. These are all guys that are the best in their nation that qualify for this tournament, and they're pretty much trying to see if they're ready for that professional realm. And I tell people, doesn't matter if you're 0-30 or 30-0 as an amateur, because when you go pro, that's when it really matters. All these fights, you can lose every single one of them as long as you learn from it. Did you really, really lose? So I think Zach would understand with this one, where at least in college, my coach would tell me, I don't care how your season goes. As long as you're the starter, that's all that matters. You could be 0-30 in every single wrestling match. But once you got to that regional tournament to qualify for nationals, that's when it mattered most. If you lost then, yes, then be upset. But all this realm is your practice. So an example is like, that's your amateur. And then when you go pro, that's when it really matters. So, you're trying to build up your job resume, and every commission is different. Every commission allows you to do different things. I remember fighting 4 times in 1 month, back to back to back to back every single weekend. Now I believe you have to have at least a full 2 weeks off just to make sure you are, capable of fighting again, and there's no brain damage or possibility of brain damage. So every state is operated by a different body, and obviously every country does the same. But amateur MMA is picking up all over the world, and as you see, organizations are starting to blossom because of it. Make full-time livings as promoters as for amateur ranks, or even again these big bodies like IMMAF, Gamma, and now the UFC, ONE FC supporting them as well. That's a huge thing. And I mean, you look at background, Lomachenko, Triple G, Canelo, De La Hoya, no matter how many fights they have as a professional, somehow, some way, their amateur record always gets brought up. I think Vasyl Lomachenko is like 396, 397-1. So
it's sort of disputed, but he's had a very large number of fights still, and it's
Rigondeaux was halfway there. De La Hoya was around 200 fights. Triple G was around almost 300 fights. So it's the fact of it, and you look at them now as professional. Do you think, they might have taken a little more of a professional beating long-term wise? Because again, for us, longevity. But the contrary to that is you're that much better and that much more prepared job resume wise to go into the professional realm. And you look at Lomachenko, again, being the biggest example, winning his first world championship I believe, in either a second or third fight, and then being one of the fastest 3-weight class world champions in 12 fights. So it's a phenomenal thing.
So yeah, so would you agree that the creation of a centralized governing body for amateur MMA has been hugely beneficial for the sport overall?
It's a huge thing. It's a huge thing, and it definitely should be in the Olympics. I know I'm actually in the process of trying to get into the Olympics now with the IMMAF, but because just like in life, it's politics, So if you see in boxing, for example, or MMA now is professional realm, there's so many different promotions. So being able to collaborate as one full body to have the Olympic Committee accept it is very difficult because everyone obviously is money hungry, this, that. But when it comes to the amateurs, just in general, like, to get as many amateur fights as possible. And it's a huge thing, especially you see the sport evolving. And for Zach being, 15-year, veteran, he can even tell that, like, man, some of these young guys are doing stuff that he did maybe when he was 30 and they're doing it at 21. It's something I'm now seeing about to be 29 and these guys are 21. And I'm like, man, I hate this kid, So it's, these amateurs are getting a lot better. And it's because of all that practice and the growth of the sport.
Yeah, so you contrast the overall IMMAF governing body and the amateur associations around the country in the US. And I think Trey would be able to comment on that specifically, like the difference between the way things are run in this overall governing body and how they are run in the individual states. Trey, please, your experiences fighting in amateur MMA.
Yes, because in Texas, that's where I live and where I fight out of. You can see kind of big differences because sometimes I know I've seen amateurs in different states, different countries. Like Jose said, people have shin guards, people have headgear, people have the big fat puffy gloves, the 7 ounces, people have the 4 ounces. In Texas, really, amateur MMA fights are very similar to like pro MMA fights. There's no like twisting leg locks, so no like heel hooks and things like that. There's no knees to the head. I think like reinforced, like the clinch, and there's no elbows to the head. So other than that, and 3-minute rounds too. Other than those things, it's very, very, very similar to a pro fight. And sometimes, again, with the good guys, like Jose was talking about, it can be indistinguishable from a pro fight. Like some guy would just be very good, and you'd be like, "Oh, this is a pro fighter," but it's an amateur fight, especially with the limited gear and everything. But no, yeah. So like, obviously, like it depends state per state, like how the infrastructure of the state is, how they develop their fighters and all that. I believe in Texas, the amateur commissions are like the same with the pro commissions. I don't think there's any like real like differentiation between either. Like it's just like obviously they do different for amateurs, but I don't think they do anything different. Like there's no amateur, like specific amateurs within the commission and whatnot. At least from my opinion, from what I've seen.
Yeah, a very common concern people raise when talking about amateur MMA is, of course, the issue of payment, first of all, and the issue of matchmaking. A lot of people who would like to start their amateur MMA career are often very concerned about the fact that they may be matched up with a guy who is much more experienced or just plain much better than them. How often do you really see that happen in amateur MMA? This is a question directed towards both Trey and Jose as well. Okay, Trey.
Yeah, I can start.
Maybe
I can start with this. Yeah. Well, my experience with amateur MMA, like matchmaking, is more so to do with like the promotions specifically. So there are a lot of promotions that run like pro cards or amateur cards or pro am cards, and the matchmakers will kind of take care of that. And most of the time, it seems to me, just from what I see, it seems to be like, I guess, like record based most of the time, which is pretty reasonable, especially when you're going with people that are like you have no knowledge over, or that are like 0-0, 0-1, 1-0. You know what I mean? So they won't more times than not, they won't put like an amateur that's like 6-0 against an 0-0 amateur. Sometimes things happen, like short notice fights or like et cetera. Somebody might pick somebody, but more times than not, they'll try to match you based off record more than anything. But again, I will say this specifically from like the promotions that I know in my specific area. I would assume it could be a lot different depending on the situation, the circumstances, where you're at, and things like that.
Yeah, at least in the amateur realm, I always tell people at least get 20 amateur fights because that's the experience you want to turn pro. Most guys don't. So their record is 5 fights, maybe even 10 fights, and then they usually go to the next realm of being a professional. So when it comes to having these guys fighting each other, The records are pretty much really similar. I've actually seen more problems in the professional realm where you see this guy fighting for a championship. Maybe he's 5-0, whatever the case may be. And then he's fighting some guy that's like 4-16 or 4-12. And you can tell these are like those setup fights. You're like, it's promoters and this and that. And obviously there's matchmakers. At least my promotion, Brave, does a really, really good job at, making some very, very fair and really well-tested fights. But then you have some promotions that are more feeder promotions that are trying to build up these guys. So they'll have this up-and-coming prospect who doesn't really have much of a record, but he's possibly undefeated, maybe one loss, versus some guy that's already past his prime at the end of his career, but he has 20-plus fights, but it's not like, 10-10. It's usually like 5-15 or whatever the case may be. So, when it comes to the matchmaking, that's hard. But again, you need a proper manager and you need to be able to, I guess, be logical with yourself and take the proper fights in both the amateur and professional realm.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I would like to bring up another point that Jose brought up that I wanted to comment on. He was talking about like he advises people to get like 20 fights, and but most people get like 5 or 10. Like in Texas, most people don't get anywhere near that amount of fights, and that's kind of not commented on. Most people get like kind of like max like 5-6 amateur fights and then they go pro. I guess I would assume it's because like in Texas, or at least again in my area, Houston area, like the amateur fights are really feel like pro fights, if I could say. Like people like, it's not like people get amateur fights back to back to back to back to back, like 3 fights in a day, 3 fights in a few weeks or whatever. It's like timetables, like 2 to 3 months for a fight, like a normal pro fight. Like people cut weight for amateur fights. People do all like the process for amateur fights over here. They treat it like a pro fight, if I could say, like in terms of just like mindset. So like it's not like I guess other places again where you get like 4 fights a day for a tournament, or like you get a fight every month, like back to back to back, or every few weeks. But that doesn't really happen much over here. So people don't have the time to get like the 20 fights because that's like already a career for them, hypothetically. Again, they get like 5 fights. They get like all those 5 fights within a year and a half, 2 years, and then they jump pro. Because they kind of already are doing pro type things, cutting weight, spending the 2-month training camp, et cetera, et cetera. So that was kind of cool to hear from like his perspective and how that.
Well, if you think about it, if we look at my record, so I had at least 26 amateur MMA fights. I did that in a span of 5 years. So technically, that's about 5 fights a year, give or take. Obviously, I've had 4 fights in 1 month. But that was, again, back in the day when there really wasn't a commission or a body that told you had to fight every 2 weeks, whatever the case may be. So I also went to school. So I was busy in my college career and I couldn't fight as often as I wanted to. And I did many tournaments. When it came to kickboxing, boxing, and Muay Thai, all these events, like you're saying, where you fight back to back to back, as an amateur, man, as long as you're not dying, as long as you're not completely injured and your brain is okay, especially your brain, then compete as much as possible. That's why I tell people, like, these last minute fights as amateur, you don't have to be at your weight class. You could be a weight class above. Hell, you might even be a 2 weight classes above. It's an amateur realm. Like if you lose, cool, yeah, sure, you lose, it sucks, it doesn't look good, whatever the case may be. But when you turn pro, that's when it really matters. That's when you cut the weight. That's when you do this. Obviously, when you're towards the end of your career as an amateur, you want to make it more of that pro mindset, like you were saying. But you definitely don't only want to stay amateur for 1 year. Unless you're 28, 29, you're already about to enter your pro, and this is kind of like your last hurrah, then sure. But if you're a young athlete in your early 20s, there's seriously no rush, because I turned pro at 23. I'm about to be 29, and I've taken some really good pro level, butt kicking. So I don't want to, sometimes I think I have brain damage too, but it's the fact of I'm spreading out my fights properly, and I might only fight until 35 years old, 40 if I'm lucky, depending if I'm financially stable enough too. So it's trying to figure stuff out that exactly you want. But as an amateur, man, get as many fights as possible if you're healthy.
Yeah. So on the issue of preparation for amateur fights, I believe Zach, you would be able to comment on that, having cornered multiple amateur fighters. How would you say, like the general, how in general does the whole scene look from the preparation side?
Yeah, so I think there is a big contrast between like a large scale international type event where you're directing your training towards this like end of the year big tournament, goal, world championships, national championships, whatever, rather than my experience has only been at local amateur events where people basically treat it like a pro fight, like Trey was saying. They do a training camp and then they fight. They just don't have a lot of information on their opponents generally because they're all fairly newer people. And because that's the way I've seen it, I don't put a very high value on it overall. Like I think the experience of fighting amateur is great. It's another way to learn a lot. But if your goal is to be the best fighter you can be and have a long career, like the most important thing is skill development, athletic development. And if your amateur fights contribute to that, great. Do as many as you can as long as you're being healthy and training well and being responsible. Like becoming the best you can be, whether you have 3 amateur fights or 30, as long, you do have to be ready for pro. But I don't think there's any like necessarily like set number of fights. It's about how you develop. And those are certainly valuable developmental skills that you learn in amateur fights. But the guys that I have been around always were rushing to fight. They haven't developed skill in a variety of areas. I try to get them to take a big picture. Like, do you want to have a long career, be a professional and be a champion? Then like, don't try to take every fight possible when you're really not ready for that. Like a lot of these guys just want to fight at any opportunity to drop the hat no matter what, instead of like taking the time to develop in the areas they need to. They're just like, I get it. It's competition. They want to be a fight. They want to fight. But I try to nudge them towards like better overall development than that type of just like fight at any, like a lot of these guys will take fights like Torres was saying, like up to weight classes with no notice just to get in there. And then there is like a lot of these promoters in local MMA, in regional MMA in the States. Basically every promotion I know is also managing some of the fighters. So they're setting up their guys to they're building the path for them and they're going to step over everyone. So you have to be careful. I mean, it's a mixed bag for me from my view of it. Because to me, it's about the development to get where you're going. And if fighting amateur, which I think can be a great developmental piece, if that helps you do it, and you can do it often, but it's not totally necessary from my perspective. But I think switching to like a international type thing changes that whole, it kind of changes the paradigm and it makes it something different. And I have no experience in that, but I like that better than the local MMA scenes that I've been around.
Yeah, like there's this issue that comes into play when you're trying to prepare for an amateur fight in the local area that way, because then you start gaining experience that doesn't necessarily translate well to your future pro career. Like, would you really fight a guy 2 weight classes up in your pro career? Really? Like, I don't think that would really happen.
I just want to step in. I just want to say I tried to, but he denied the fight. So I was trying to be a 3 weight class champion, and he denied the fight.
All right, okay, so that happens. That happens, but sometimes the other guy is a pussy. Just being cheeky, of course. No professional fighter is ever that way. Anyway, Dan, haven't heard from you in a while. Would you offer any insight?
Yeah, man. I like a lot of the things everyone was saying. I could see, I have no experience with amateur or pro in Texas, but I could see what Treyvon was saying, because you look at guys, you know, obviously a lot of this stuff is pro parallels amateur issues in a lot of the things I've seen. And I recently reached out to a lot of coaches with a more current view and more relevant view on the amateur scene. And that it seems to parallel there. So for example, with you know, for all the pros and cons that the Texas Commission, you know, mainly cons, no offense, gets lobbied at them. Perhaps it's not a surprise that they would have, you know, looser regulations. For example, you look at Kevin Holland, and I don't know if it's XKO, XK. There's like a Chicago organization with a real similar name. I don't want to get them confused. Yeah, XFO, and it looks like they do pro am, which is important, and I'll touch on that in a second. but you also see like Holland had a lot of his Muay Thai bouts in there, right? So it sounds like a really wild mixed bag. However, and again, this is very differing opinions, because I don't believe Tough Enough still has a connection, although which is the organization that I also fought for. With I see on Jose's record as far as the IMAF, and I actually remember all that tournament. I was just brushing over that. I remember all that going down and whatnot. But from what I'm told, it's really important for amateur promotions to have pro shows as well. Again, without outing certain people, I was told it could be problematic in certain aspects because, for example, like again, Jose, obviously, you're a talented MFer. You're an outlier. You had great winning streaks, titles, multiple weight classes, and you made the jump all right, and are a great example as to why that experience. And Jose actually sentimented a lot of the examples I was going to say, because I'm very ignorant even to boxing, much less other sports. But you're right. You hear these fighters kind of reference their amateur records, and I feel like taking it more seriously. Kind of to Zach's point, as far as I kind of have a come see come saw kind of attitude as far as the amateur scene as well. But kind of like what Zach sentimented, I'm not against some kind of overbodying organization or something that really takes it seriously and treats them like professionals because of the top-down mentality. And let's be honest, you professionals aren't treated that well in the first place. So the fact that,
Nope.
which is another issue, and I'm spitballing a lot here, but the fact that seems to be a problem with a lot of the people that I've talked to from my own experiences. And let's be honest, it's common sense, is that a lot of the amateurs, whether you want to say, well, they're amateurs, this is part of every job. If you want to work as a tattoo artist, you have to apprentice. And I get that. I'm not stepping into those boundaries here, but it's not a surprise. It shouldn't be a surprise that amateurs get treated a lot worse. Not just even from the normal leverage points as pros. I even experienced it to kind of a lesser effect when I had to corner someone last minute. I think it was in 2019 was the last time I cornered. It wasn't for Tough Enough. It's for another Las Vegas organization that was still using the ring ropes. And I saw Mazzagatti there, and I'm like, where's this guy been? And he still thinks it's like 2008 and he's the cock of the walk. And he was like, just, yelling at me, yelling at, other commission members. And it just seems like a real place to flex. The promoters, this is the closest they're ever going to get to Dana White. So they're walking around like it, you know what I'm saying? And they'll talk to you guys, the experienced pros and coaches like a Zach Makovsky of the world. It ends up rubbing off, and they'll talk to you guys that way. And you guys are like, hey, okay, all right, hold on a second. Hopefully, I'm assuming you speak up for yourself and your fighters, but there's a lot of those attitudes there too. So just long and the short of it, I sentiment a lot with what you guys already said. I would be curious on what your guys' opinions are as far as amateur programs that don't offer the pro route, because there's pros and cons to both of those. But for me, a lot of the parallels, which I'm sure we'll get into here, is it seems to parallel a lot of the pro struggle, but even worse, which I guess doesn't sound like a surprise, but yeah.
Yeah, like if you think about it, ideally, what amateur MMA should be, if you look at the more established sports like wrestling or boxing, amateur sports is a way for you to gain enough experience. Well, not wrestling, but boxing at least is the place where you experience as many different style matchups as possible, where you gain as much experience as possible fighting different opponents with different builds, different attributes, etc. And having gained that experience over hundreds and hundreds of rounds of live fighting, essentially, then you move to pros, and then you're basically a complete fighter that can do it all. And right now, we don't really see that, especially since many amateur organizations basically essentially mimic pro MMA, as you've said, but see in a kind of a more ramshackle way. But yeah, to go back to the original question, I'm sorry I interrupted. Just had to voice this thought.
No, I'm sorry if I kind of spitballed a bunch of stuff there, but no, I like that. And it's just an interesting argument because, you go to the mileage argument, right? To a lot of it. I mean, we're comparing boxing because it's like our closest neighbor, and not to do the overly pro MMA stat that we're so much safer than boxing,
No.
There's so much less head trauma. I mean, that varies,
Sure, there isn't.
So you kind of get into that territory. And I definitely am not one to relitigate those arguments, but there is some things in experience. And I guess one thing I wanted to touch on and throw to you guys is, it's interesting because I heard a coach say once tell me that, it depends on how long you want to stay as an amateur to go pro. And it's a real double-edged sword. He said as an example, for example, if I have a guy that's a wrestler and he comes from a wrestling background, I'll feel more comfortable if he wants to get that experience because he's percentage-wise, he's probably gonna be taking a lot less damage. These are shorter rounds, smaller cages and rings, that are going to benefit the grappler. We can get him on top more. If he wants to get that experience, I would feel better about it than a guy who's more of an action fighter, jiu-jitsu submissions. He's throwing, head kicks. He's giving up position. That guy's going to give away his mileage a lot less faster. And if his goal is in fact back to the goals, which is important. What's your goal here? If his goal is in fact to go pro, and sure, he may have a wild, not the best fight IQ. I mean, who does? It's a very small percentage, right? It's a tough thing to do. You guys are under duress out there. But still, that this is his goal. Does he want to spend all that miles in the amateurs? However, conversely, using the wrestler example, those are like the one guys you see kind of rush to the plate. Bellator is trying to sign these guys before they've taken their last college test. Everyone's trying to get their hands on these guys. And to their credit, they've traditionally, not to feed that trope, but they've traditionally done well. Yeah, I was looking at a lot of undefeated fighters who had undefeated runs and long undefeated meaningful runs. They are either wrestlers and or come from grappling backgrounds. So it's an interesting double-edged sword. It's like that style is good enough to give you early success, but do you want to do that and get that experience and not getting paid? So I feel like the argument of pro to am kind of bleeds into perhaps a more important argument is, how about just making the mark instead of pro to amateur, just getting your experience before you get to the big stage, whether that's Bellator, the UFC, because that's where I feel like you can really run into trouble. And the decisions before maybe are based more on what your goals, back to what Zach said, what are your goals here? Are you trying to get paid? Are you trying to be a pro? Are you trying to get a title? And I think that'll parse itself out in the earlier parts.
Yeah, it's kind of a question of incentives, isn't it? Like, what will incentivize you towards taking a longer amateur career as opposed to immediately going pro? Like, let's say, in short term, I may be able to receive some money, some monetary compensation that can go into training, but it also may bring about a situation where I just get damaged, just get so damaged in a pro fight that I will take a long time to recover. All my money is going to go towards recovery, and then it's basically a net negative. Meanwhile, conversely, in a more permissive, I suppose, more lenient amateur MMA rule set that doesn't lead to as much damage, that may lend itself better to a more prolonged career long term. And this is, I believe, something that Jose Shorty, please comment on that.
Yo, I have a quick question, Zach. If you're comfortable with it, how much did you make your pro debut? You can do it, Zach.
Zach. Everyone's just fucking up.
My bad.
One after another.
So I didn't fight amateur at all. Now this was a long time ago when I first made my debut. But amateur was like kind of just getting going. Like the guy I fought in my first fight was one of the only people I had heard of that had amateur fights at this time. This is late 2006. Mm-hmm. And I decided not to. I saw there were amateur fights available. I could have taken an amateur fight. I didn't, and it had nothing to do with, I'm going to make money. I made $300 to show and $200 to win for my first pro fight, plus a percentage of ticket sales. Okay. So it had nothing to do with the money. It had to do with the rules that were allowed in the amateur contest. Like I was a Division I wrestler. I'd wrestled my whole life. I had done some no-gi in some tournaments, but my game was going to be takedown and ground and pound. And the amateur rules were no ground and pound to the head in amateur fights. I'm like, that's like my whole game.
Oh, that's the worst thing about some amateur organizations and amateur rules.
Plus the amateur rules were like, the amateur wasn't really going, and the time was different. Like now I would feel much less comfortable getting in to going no amateur right to pro with these guys that have a large amateur background. It just didn't exist at the time. So there's a lot of things that played into it, but that was my rationale. It was basically the rule set that made me decide to not fight amateur.
The reason why I asked, like one of my good friends is Curtis Blades, and obviously one of the highest ranked heavyweights right now in the world. He makes a crap ton of money right now, which I'm very happy for him. But he had to work his way up there. Given heavyweights are different, obviously they get paid more naturally just because they're more exciting, quote unquote. But his pro debut actually was for XFL in Chicago. I believe he made 200, and he had maybe 5 amateur fights. You know, he just kind of went in. Now, myself, I ended up turning pro immediately to Titan FC compared to a smaller regional promotion. And I was able to make 1,000 plus ticket sales. So I'm making pretty much 5, 6, 7 times more than what Curtis Blades did. Now, obviously, different generation, different time, obviously, compared to when you started. And obviously, I think 3 years after Curtis started. But the reason why I got paid so much more wasn't just because I was a good fighter, it's because I had the resume. It's just like any job. You know, if you go in there with some type of, gigantic resume, you can ask for more because obviously you've been able to show that you can do more work. So when it comes to looking at, do I want to fight amateur for longer? That's why I say if you're young and you're still going to college like I was like, well, I'm just going to graduate first and then I'll, fight just in case if I get hurt or maybe I'm just not that good. At least I have something to fall back on. So I got my college degree and then turned pro. And I was like, oh, well, I'm not going to get my master's because now I'm semi getting paid well. You look at Amanda Ribas, you look at Liam McCord, you look at more fighters that did the IMMAF. They got a lot of fights as amateur. Mohammed Mukaev, who's part of the Brave Combat Federation, that guy makes so much money in sponsorships. It is ridiculous. I'm actually really upset, but also proud of him, because he has the amateur resume to prove that he is one of the best. And he literally copied exactly what I did, just promoted that much more. It's just that, the generation's evolving. So it depends on what you're looking at. If you're older, need money, just, okay, cool, go pro and, wish for the best and hopefully all goes well. If you're young, get a college degree, save some money and fight as much amateur to get all the experience you can. So when you turn pro, you make that much more money. But there is that whole, man, you might be taking some pro level beatings before you even get up there, depending on your fighting style. Smaller guys in boxing, and I'm going to use that as a reference. Boxers, you look at Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, I believe he's only 32, 33, and they're like, oh, he's already past his prime. And maybe 33 is technically past your prime, but smaller guys are more active. We might not get as many knockouts, but we're a lot more active. That means we're taking a lot more blows to the head. Smaller guys
are not only more active, they also have way more violent fights usually.
Yeah, and heavyweights, what happens? It's literally one good shot, and they're like, oh, well, I guess I'll fight in 3 months. And they're perfectly fine, and they get back to it. I mean, you look at Alistair Overeem, when he got knocked out by Francis Ngannou, it looks brutal, it's horrible, but that was one punch. It's like, that's one punch with a little bit of damage. He wakes up, all right, cool, I guess I'm going to fight in 3 to 6 months and get right back to it. And have a pro career, I believe, what is Alistair, like 40-something? So is, what's his name? Anyways, there's more guys. Arlovsky's like 42 still fighting. You got Olenek.
Arlovsky has an excellent deal, really. He just shows up, split decision someone, and gets paid 6 figures.
Olenek, he's in his like early mid 40s. Like he's still fighting, but you don't see small guys do that. Small guys don't have that longevity. The guys in the middleweights, it really depends on your fighting stuff. You're Floyd Mayweather, Lomachenko, move around, you're good, but that's not my style. Look at Gaethje. Look at Diego Sanchez, is probably a prime example. That guy should have quit a long time ago, So and I love Diego Sanchez, but you got some guys who take a little more damage than they should, and they haven't learned yet.
So going back to your point about, I agree with everything you were saying about like building your amateur resume and that being like a springboard that you can use to help kickstart your pro career at a higher level than you would otherwise. But that's why I think like the IMMAF is a different kind of paradigm than these local MMA shows. Like you could be a local amateur MMA champion, and I don't know how much you're going to be able to use that to springboard your resume. But these like bigger ones where there's national tournaments, world tournaments, that's that's something worth as an amateur fighter, like putting in time to have that as a goal. Like Olympic boxers, like Lomachenko, the Olympic gold medal was his primary goal, right? There's no without IMMAF or anything, there's no like amateurs that are like, my goal is to be an amateur champion. Like that's not the goal. If there is some kind of like world level prestigious event, I think that changes the whole way amateur MMA can be viewed. And that's kind of was my point.
Yeah, and also
sorry, go ahead. I
All
was
right.
just going to add on real quick. I think that kind of adds on to the the pro versus or the amateur shows that have pro relationships, because I think that even if with politics being a thing, and even if you got to go through crappy matchmaking, you don't have connections. If you build yourself through you can use that resume like Jose said, which I totally agree with as well. But also, if it's a show that does amateur and pro shows, then perhaps you've been able to build rapport to go into pros. Or even if that wasn't your goal, like me, like I just wanted to commentate, which I still haven't done, but they were letting a lot of the amateur fighters commentate. No offense to my comrades there, but they sucked. And I was like, I could do this really well, but let me just, I wanted to get, I wanted to get some amateur fights in just for my own itch as a martial artist anyways. So why don't I, Head Trauma had something else to say about it, which again, it doesn't take a lot, folks. It could just take, one good one, or it can happen in training. But I do, especially hearing you guys talk, I do see maybe benefits that shows that offer that. And again, it's weird where states are like, for example, you're talking about the heavyweights and the lighter weights. I felt like you're explaining all of Khalil Roundtree's fights that I went to for Tough Enough. They were just quick knockouts at heavyweight, and the skill level is much different at amateur heavyweight. Not talking bad about heavyweights. Believe me, I'm just saying like it was.
Please
just took one big shot.
Different.
Please, yeah, please.
Different.
Specifically
Very
mentioned
diplomatic.
But one last thing is that Justin James, who just fought this weekend, for example, he only has a certain amount of amateur fights, like the Tough Enough ones listed on his record. But he was in a state like Michigan that had a weird loophole where you didn't just have pro-am shows, but they were paying their amateurs because they were pro-am shows. Perhaps another benefit, granted, that's a little more wild west regulation, but again, perhaps a benefit for pro-am shows. And Justin was going to college in wrestling, and he was able to actually fight in between, but also make money, which, kind of motivated him to take more. He was still able to graduate, but he was done with school by the time and just wanted to fight, granted. But, that was a pretty sweet deal for him. He still, made it to the UFC, but, you'd have to ask him as far as how he feels, for his age and miles. But, if you can get into a state where they're actually paying you, and, maybe that's not a bad deal either.
I mean, asking Justin Gaethje what he thinks about his career so far would be extremely interesting, since he's just so brutally honest about everything. I mean, the guy just went out.
I look up to that guy, not just in physicality, but he has the same fighting style. When I made my debut for the UFC, I was like, I'm a Justin Gaethje to the flyweight division. Like, I just don't care. But to get back to your thing, I hope you do commentate. I really do. I think that'd be awesome. The only problem is, don't ever commentate where you have two guys that you might fight and you commentate for their fight, and then after it's such a close decision where they both look at you and go, who do you think won? And you're put on the spot. So I just want to say, hopefully you don't get put in that position.
Don't worry, it wasn't that close. It wasn't that close.
It wasn't that close. It really wasn't. I thought you won. I swear I thought you won. Oh, God. That was a fun day. I was like, oh, cool. I'm just here. All right.
Well, the thing is, this actually parlays. I don't have to worry about that because I won't be fighting. However, I would have to worry about that, which is a reason why I won't judge or do officiating, is because you guys know how it is. Especially if for me, I'm in Vegas. I've been going to Extreme Couture since practically it opened. I know way too many people, to not be biased, and I respect the job, the sport, the results, and the fighters way too much to put that. And I feel like overall in the sport, through anything from media, commentating, whatever, people don't admit their biases enough. That's a whole nother conversation.
Oh, yeah.
But relating it to this conversation, relating it back to this conversation, I believe that's another problem too, is that the biases, not even just promotions and politics is what you have to deal with on the pro level as well as the amateur, but the certain biases and certain things like, for example, I wrote down ISKA, and all I have next to it from people I asked, like current coaches, is pain in the ass, necessary evil. And, you get gyms that, are good about, letting these coaches in to get reps, especially here in Vegas. They're very lucky to have that opportunity, right? And these gyms are good about making that. But then there's all these politics, with gyms and coaches, with referees or promotions, and you'll see, promotion heavily booking certain, fighters from one gym and not from the other. And, I know that's a part of life, and much less the pro life, but I feel like that's a really strong presence in amateur that goes unchecked, just the biases.
Yeah, more people should be upfront about their biases, analysts especially, because it's our job to evaluate everything. And sometimes you just forget to do it. But either way, to just sort of bring us back on track, amateur MMA, and this is going to be a kind of weird one, but I would like to really compare the development of amateur sports and how the interplay between amateur sports and pro sports on using the example of, say, other sports that do not necessarily have anything to do with fighting. And so, Trey, please, as the foremost NASCAR expert over here, please, quick historical overview. I think it started as amateur racing, wasn't it? Didn't it?
What? No, no. To get back, I guess to get into the history of NASCAR, they were like moonshiners, basically running like alcohol during the Prohibition. Make things long story short, they were souping up their cars to run away from the cops, and then they were like, and then after everything, alcohol was legal and all that, they were like, well, we got fast cars, might as well just race them, and boom, 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 we got fast cars racing on tracks now. But I think like the question that you asked, and like how can amateur like sports influence the pros? Unfortunately, in my opinion, I think the pro MMA does a lot more influencing the amateur scene than the amateur scene does for MMA, because pro MMA, like again, speaking what Zach was talking about, how there was not even really an amateur scene when he was coming up, but there was a pro scene just purely developed, and so he just did pro because, again, obviously a lot of other things were better for him and all that. But like he didn't even have really like the best amateur infrastructure to even go through, and that was in, I think you said like 2006, right? 2005. And so so MMA as a sport had been around for a decade prior. Before then, there's only pro fights really in MMA. There's no amateur system. There's no building yourself up. Like UFC 1, you just coming in there, boom, just fighting off the rip. So I think for MMA specifically, there's no development, amateur developing pro fighters. I think pro has a lot more influence in terms of developing the amateur scene. Again, getting back into like the fight structure again, about like here in Texas, like there's pro am cards for a lot of the promotions, and so obviously people amateurs train with pros all the time. You know this. So you have a pro teammate fighting on the pro card, and you're fighting on the amateur card. The amateur card, not even the same card. They're on the same card. So prelims is the amateur, pro is the main card. For the amateurs, they're taking their 2 to 3 month camps, because that's kind of when the amateur fights are booked, at least in our area. It's not like you can, like join. Well, not as easy to join like national amateur leagues, like how Jose was talking about, which are very awesome and cool. When you're in the local scene, it's just like you take your every few months, and that's the pro structure bleeding its way into the amateur structure. People weight cut a lot more, and like again in my area with amateur, that's the pro structure bleeding into the amateur structure. Like people don't fight at a weight class really. They try to make it at their weight. Like they try to like, if they're 35ers, they're gonna fight at 35. If they're 70ers, they're gonna fight at 70. You know what I mean? And obviously, yeah, you'll see people be a little more lax amateur than pro. Yes, that is true. But I think it's the pro game that bleeds into the amateurs, and at least in MMA. I'm pretty sure in other sports it's probably different. Amateur can kind of bleed into the pro and shift how the way the game is played, shift the way how the meta is played and all that. But still, for MMA, I don't think that's the case at all.
Well, yeah, that's right now. That's obviously it's more apparent in how the whole system is set up. But what do you think are the developments that need to be made in order for amateur MMA to start actually influencing the pro game? Like, what would you like to see personally? Like, for example, in the US, at least, in your area, at least.
That's a really good question. I haven't really thought much about that. Really, I would probably say, I guess, probably there needs to be some differentiation, some differences between the pro and the amateur game. Not like, and it's kind of some set identified rule sets as well, because amateur scenes are so different, like where you're at. Maybe different rule sets, different scoring criteria. Like I believe in pro amateur boxing, it's just kind of based on like points, like in terms of like literally each strike point. And obviously that has ramifications down the line for people's games and how they tailor it depending on what they're doing. But I guess for looking at something that I would like, I guess I could say probably. I haven't really thought about that. That's a good question. No, yeah, I guess you have to come back to me later. I have to think about that.
Well, well, the first thing that springs to mind is that the problem with the changing the rules and trying to adjust the rules for amateurs is that the sheer fact that there are so many win conditions in MMA. How do you like? It's an uphill battle trying to come up with good rules for pro MMA in the first place, and now you have the amateurs, and now you start thinking about, well, you start being concerned about limiting damage. But if you limit damage, these amateur fighters are going to end up with styles that wouldn't work in the pros. And there's going to be a more of a transitional period. And then you start worrying about those things as well. And you kind of just sit down and go, like, shit, what do we do? Like, for example, banning, once again, banning ground strikes to the head in amateurs, in certain amateur organizations in certain states. Like, this is ridiculous when you think about it. Like, you're just taking away a whole facet from a fighter's style, maybe his most potent style, most potent facet of his style. And so, yeah, it's
pretty ridiculous to see someone mounted on someone and just punching their body. It's like really weird.
I mean, we should see more of it. It's pretty rad actually. But the problem is that since the other guy knows that he's going to only be hit in the body, he's just gonna go like this. It's just kind of weird.
That's what happens.
If you go back and watch the, I think it was Rings, the organization in which Fedor fought way back when during the 90s, they actually did that. They forbid strikes to the head and ground and pound. It looked ridiculous.
They had rope escapes. Didn't they have rope escapes too?
They had rope escapes. Yeah, that's actually fun. That's kind of fun.
It is.
Although grapplers would hate it.
Kind of fun.
And I mean, I guess since we're on the topic of how amateur MMA can develop, I guess Jose can contest to the idea of centralizing amateur MMA into a single governing organization, single overarching organization. What sort of benefits does it bring compared to regional scenes? What do you think? What's your experience?
I know with the IMMAF, we're definitely trying to make that, especially for every nation, because every nation has their own governing body, and every nation that has states like the U.S. has every separate governing body with every single state. Texas is very strict compared to California is a little more open. Illinois is pretty strict compared to Florida. No one cares at all, So
I mean, it's Florida.
It's like its own country, it really is. But yeah, you should have seen the masks. Like no one ever wore them. Anyways. So it's the crazy thing that I believe there should be a governing body through the government itself, because like in other nations that we see, like Sweden's whole team is funded by the government, like an actual government, not just like some governing body. Like it's funded by the country, and it's like, yeah, this is awesome. So trying to be able to get that funded through the U.S. itself would be a huge thing, and be able to implement a commission, our own commission through the U.S., whether it's the IMMAF or USF, which is another organization that we have. And there's other leagues as well that like to claim to be the national organization. So it becomes a little difficult, but trying to get every state to cooperate with each other, because again, at least when I was amateur, before I even turned 18, all I did was pancration because headshots weren't allowed. So like Zach was saying, you take someone down, you just start throwing punches if you don't know any jiu-jitsu, which was me back in the day. And then when you went amateur, then pretty much everything was allowed. And then it slowly started to get like, okay, now no more knees or elbows to the head. All right, cool. Now you have to wear shin guards. All right, now we're wearing 7-ounce gloves, yada, yada, yada. So I believe there should be something adapted to every single state that's very, very similar. But that's the hardest part, is every state's different. Everyone has different opinions. And again, it gets extremely political. But with that, and I believe there should be a recommendation, especially in the states of, I think if you're under a certain age, you have to have at least 10 amateur fights to even qualify turning pro, because you got some guys, man, that just go in there and honestly, they're just not that good. And they get demolished as a professional. They're used as bums or those feeder people. And you see those people taking some really, really bad beatings against very, very high level guys. So I believe there should be even a resume about turning pro, but that's, again, my personal opinion. I just don't like seeing people get hurt.
Yeah.
I think like unified amateur MMA rules might be decent. Like, not that you're like in pro, there's unified rules. I don't know if it's mandatory every state abide by them, but everyone does, right?
Yeah.
For the most part.
I mean,
Yeah, no, it's a good thing.
if only the judges actually understood the unified rules, that would be great.
Is
And some open scoring and us.
Yeah.
Shorty, is IMMAF scored the same way, like 10-point must system?
Yeah, from what I know, I believe they're still in a 10-point must system, which is again becomes difficult. But a lot of these judges, like I've seen while I was commentating some of the fights, I've seen fighters win off their back because some guy, so happened to be a really good wrestler, but knew no jiu-jitsu and just stayed in guard the entire time. It kind of reminded me of Kyoji versus Darian Caldwell in the Bellator match, where Darian took him down and Kyoji was just like, I'm just gonna punch you the entire time, or I'm gonna try to throw submissions the entire time, and Darian stood on top. But it's definitely changed, especially since you started back in the day. You took someone down, didn't matter if you did anything, as long as you held them down, they were on the ground, they lost. Now it's like if they're throwing submissions now, or if they're actually punching back, that's points, depending on the state, depending on the place. Okay, I see your face already, depending on where you go. But it just depends on I guess the judges. I like action, but that's just me.
I sentiment Jose's previous sentiment of not wanting to see people get hurt, man. I would see those matchups of pro or amateur and just you're like, oh, how did this get made? And as a guy who ended up like one of those guys, I was like, oh yeah, it can happen. So as somebody who had to play that role, I appreciate that. That's a little tougher to weed out, but I just agree with your guys' overall sentiment from top down, from Treyvon saying top down from how pros, how pros run things. And of course, obviously the pros could and should, benefit from that, to what you guys are saying, overall bodies, making sure we're on the same page. Because even here in Vegas, as lucky as we were to train at a place with an amateur team like Extreme Couture, we had rings for, if it was here, we had cages, which we still do, obviously, for it was there. But it was weird. You go down to Texas, it's a little more lax. You go to our neighbors in California, it's a little more tight. You go up to Washington, we're in full pads and you can't do anything. I'm like, well, I should have fought here. But yeah, I agree with what you guys said, just top down and kind of oversight and consistency.
I mean, of course, therein comes the question of how would you sort of keep those governing bodies in check themselves, especially if they are especially if they are overlooked by the government itself. Like, for example, well, obviously NCAA is not a government organization; it's a non-profit, and recently it's been hit with a lawsuit that's been satisfied. I think it's been verified, at least, that like one of the Supreme Court basically ruled that the behavior of NCAA is basically grounds for an antitrust lawsuit, and just they've hit them over the head with an antitrust, and I think they're going to be forced to actually provide compensation to athletes, which is a great thing, obviously. And this goes back to the question of how would you incentivize people going into amateur MMA? What sort of, would you like there to be some sort of monetary compensation, medical compensation at least, like covering the cost of training, well, all that stuff? Like, how would you go about it? Like, Shorty, personally, how would you go about it? What do you think about it?
Not gonna lie, I kind of zoned out. So we talk about money.
Well,
So I was reading the email.
Basically, yes. I mean, yeah.
So, I mean, for me, one of the biggest things that I did, especially the amateur coming up, I just followed the veterans. A lot of the guys that I trained with were professionals. I mean, that's how I even met or even heard of Zach Makovsky, because I was training Joshua Sampo for his second UFC fight, and it was against Zach. So with me, it was kind of like following what they were trying to do at the time, trying to receive sponsorships, trying to find incentives, trying to make connections to where people were funding them to train. Me, I had a full ride in college, so I didn't have to work full time at all. So I had money saved up. But when it came to turning or having some of these fights, man, like I had the same gear for almost about 5 years, so I was punching people from, with the glove, and then eventually punching people with my fist that so happened to be covered by some sock and bopper glove, so it's just one of those things that it's really hard, especially in this sport. There's so many sacrifices because you have to train and then also possibly work full time. I mean, Zach knows for sure that there's a lot of UFC fighters that still have part-time jobs. You know, so it becomes very, very difficult in general. I know we're definitely all underpaid, but as amateurs and professionals, especially with social media being a huge presence, again, I think a prime example is these YouTube fighters making these celebrity death matches, making millions of dollars, but they've only had 1 or 2 boxing fights or making their pro debut and they're making millions, you know? So, you have to use social media as a huge game, especially when it comes to sponsorships, when it comes to promoting, when it comes to making networking connections and being able to use that even to sell more tickets, to get paid more by the time you turn professional. And it's a huge thing, but a lot of guys, even now, still today, don't know how to promote themselves and make money on the side through fighting. Like right now, while we're doing this, I'm actually doing a business deal right now on my laptop. So it's one of those things that you have to try to learn to multitask, especially in this sport. It's not about how good you are anymore. It's about how popular and how many tickets you can sell.
Yeah, that's pretty much
You
exactly
gotta
my
be a promoter and a fighter.
Yeah.
Can't just be a fighter.
yeah. That's something that really interests me about amateur sports, because like with amateur sports, it really sort of like kind of takes out this element of just this being all about money, because with certain amateur sports there's just prestige that comes with being good at a sport. Like let's say like a sport like, I don't know, wrestling, so a sport like judo, a sport like basically just any Olympic sports. And still, if the sport is like old enough or established enough, there's still compensations from the government that are given to the athletes and from the Olympic Committee as well. And so I think I mean, it's a long way from here, but if we get there, if we are able to get there, then I think amateur sports, amateur MMA could, I think, in a certain way, offset this monopoly that the UFC has on the market. That would be something interesting, and that would be really a sight to see. But I mean, everyone can dream, I guess.
That's the hardest part. I mean, you look at all these deals that the UFC, being the biggest promotion in the world, is making. None of that money goes to the fighters. Obviously, that's what Brendan Schaub, really put out there when the Reebok deal came in. He's like, dude, I was making $100,000+ every single fight through my sponsorships. I made more money than I did fighting, but now I got this Reebok deal, and it's telling me because I only have 5 or 6 fights on the Zuffa banner, I make $5,000 a fight. Like that makes no sense. So, it's being able to hopefully one day have the UFC, and because they're the leader of MMA, they could possibly change the fact of maybe they use this new Venom deal to pay these fighters for training camps instead of, hey, we're only going to pay you when you fight. Have this as like a spread out thing. Because again, most guys have a full-time job, have a part-time job, have a family, have kids, and now they're more focused on working than they are training, or they're too tired to train because of work, or they're not training as hard because they have more work in the morning. So it becomes very, very difficult. But I wish other promotions would do something where they give these fighters incentives to train and pay them to train instead of, just fight or get paid to fight.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
what's the IMMAF policy towards sponsorships? Do the fighters get they can do whatever they want with sponsorships, or does the IMMAF benefit a bit from it?
From what I know, I believe that IMMAF allows. Anything outside the cage, you're able to get sponsored by. You can show it off fight week, but when it comes to the IMMAF, because it is a nonprofit organization, they need as much money donated as possible to get the referees, the judges, everyone to be able to fly into whatever country you're doing it. So I know like their gear sponsors, Green Hill, it clothes them, it does the MMA gloves, shin guards, all that stuff. So they're paid through Green Hill, but again, that's nonprofit wise to be able to fund everything else. But when you have other promotions, when you have other promotions like the UFC that make millions of dollars off of this, that doesn't go to the fighters unless they fight. Like these guys in the IMMAF, like fighters in general, are able to keep the gear. They're able to. You're pretty much buying it because you have to buy in to the. You have to register, so you're buying your gear. So everything you get to keep. But when it comes to free stuff, I wouldn't say right now you get any free stuff. But again, that's a nonprofit organization compared to the UFC that is making all these buildings and doing this and doing that, but nothing has really been helping the fighters. I think the only thing that's really been helping the fighters is the UFC PI, because everything is technically free when you're there. But what's the big thing we're talking about right now? There's no health insurance for these guys. It's like, man, I get punched in the face for a living. Like my brain hurts. I want to go to the doctor and see if I can get some really good ibuprofen or something, but we have to pay for it ourselves. Like I'm not insured. I don't know if Zach's insured. So if I happen to break my leg right now, I got to pay for that all myself, So it gets very difficult for fighters, but it's also being able to save as much money as possible through different, incentives.
Yeah, and that's like a decade. It's been a decade since I fought amateur, and what Jose was citing was like, top of the top of the market, right? UFC, the top treatment that a fighter can get on paper, proverbial. I'm using air quotes here for anybody just listening, but like, yeah, that was still the same. You're still incentivized the same. I remember I popped because I kind of had that attitude like Jose. I was trying to take as much boxing smokers, kickboxing smokers. I actually won a grappling tournament like a month before my amateur fight, but in like the final match, I allowed a guy to pop my knee with a heel hook attempt. I got on top and was able to finish, but just stupid ego. Like, why did I let that happen? I already had this fight on the books that was much more important. But I remember I was incentivized to be like, you know what, even though I'm not an amateur, Tough Enough has $1,000 deductible. So I'm going to go and claim, regardless of how the fight goes, I'm going to go and claim I got this knee injury in the fight. And then, because I was unemployed. And even when I was employed, especially with a lot of people today, it doesn't mean you have health insurance. So even if you're a pro fighter in the UFC, you still have to have another job. You still might not have that insurance, and you're still kind of incentivized through these things. So I felt that was a great point by Jose that I just wanted to piggyback on, and overall say that the points that he and you guys are making, again, a lot of these are top down, trickle down effects here that we feel where these problems kind of tend to parallel.
Yeah, that's I mean, it's a really kind of broad topic that has to do with if you really want to get to the bottom of this whole thing, you need to just kind of hit the economics angle. You want to look at how these governing bodies, that's the centralized governing bodies of amateur MMA, are going to function. Where are they going to get money from? How are they going to compensate the fighters? How they are going to incentivize fighters to get into amateur MMA? And how would you sort of offer an alternative to pro MMA? Like, since pro MMA is basically dictating the way amateur MMA now works, you're going to have to provide some sort of like a benefit that pro MMA doesn't provide. Yeah, and it's an uphill battle. Figuring out pro MMA is an uphill battle in the first place, and amateur MMA is just a kind of like another can of worms. That's it's just kind of like a rabbit hole of different topics.
I do have one question that I remember I wanted to ask when Jose was talking about sponsorship, and perhaps I'll pitch it to the panel here, but again, back to the top down and back to even the rules we were talking about, or the fact that Extreme Couture eventually got rid of its rings and has cages. Like, the gyms will adapt, but even the best of gyms and the best of places, we need these kind of reforms and things to adapt to more consistently. But in regards to the sponsorship, I believe that theme travels down, because even though the social media aspect you guys were talking about, that you have to fight and promote, or sometimes at the same time, depending on your opinion on that Joe Schilling video, neither here nor there. But the fact is, even with like social media and this movement not being as strong like a decade ago, or even like half a decade or ago, because I know, or not even a decade ago, it was right after that. Like I look at Jose's record, he was fighting for that same organization as myself a couple of years later. I still felt like while the UFC had sponsors, like even amateurs, that was one thing. I still felt like I saw the drop down banners. Instagram wasn't as big, but like the sponsorship market seemed more fluid from the top down. So when the pros were eating, the amateurs were eating too. Now, I know that a lot of complaints from the pros, even outside the UFC, is that they affected that market greatly, the sponsorship market, even outside of their own, they affected the whole biome, so to speak. So I guess my question to you guys, or even as Treyvon as an active fighter, or you guys cornering active amateur fighters today, have you guys seen that effect? Is it harder for these amateurs? Do we see less, even though social media is expanded, do we still see less names behind them?
Who wants to go first?
Who's quicker in the draw? Come on.
I don't think
Fine.
I don't think I know any amateur guys that are getting any financial sponsorship. Only like free gear or supplements and stuff like that. Other than that, maybe when they fight, and they get some. And if that is the case, it's like local businesses who they have a personal relationship with. But other than that, I don't see anyone getting any kind of like financial help from like MMA type companies or whatever.
Yeah, it's really rare. I'm sorry to cut you off. Yeah, it's really rare because I actually I have my own foundation and I sponsor a handful of fighters, and I'm trying to teach them that because I wish I would have known that when I was younger. Whether it's to get free gear, which Zach understands, it's like, man, I just want some free stuff right now. I don't even care about the money. I just need gear to train, or I need clothes, or this or that. Like, it sucks. So I tell people to grow with the businesses, and as your pro career or your amateur career slowly grows up, then hopefully that business grows as well. And then you can start asking for money or doing this or asking for more incentives. I was lucky when I turned pro that I was being funded monthly, but there's some people obviously that just don't have that opportunity, have to work full-time jobs. So it becomes extremely difficult, but it's also learning, which they don't teach us in school, of how to manage our money and being able to fix other stuff. But again, that's a whole different system. So it's not hard to get money, at least for me, when it comes to sponsors, but you have to ask. Closed mouth doesn't get fed, and you have to know how to do it appropriately and respectfully.
No, yeah, and like tying into their points, I very rarely see amateurs getting deals. Most of them are through like their own pro teammates who put them onto something or get them in connection with other people. But even then, that's rare for the pros themselves in the regional areas. So yeah, most amateurs they don't have much in terms of sponsorship, because most pros don't have much in terms of sponsorship. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that just goes to show just how young the sport is in general. Like the idea was to compare and contrast amateur MMA and pro MMA, but right now all I'm getting from this conversation is that they're just intrinsically connected. You can't really contrast them. They just function in similar ways. The way pro MMA functions, the same way amateur MMA is going to function, and it's yeah. Just once again, a long way from here. Oh, I suppose I hope IMMAF is going to provide, is going to continue growing and continue just sort of building, and maybe at some point we're going to see this centralization where MMA is going to start being sponsored by actual governments to just kind of create actual programs for athletes to compete in and to just sort of gain experience and grow as athletes, grow as fighters, and then maybe we'll see some kind of like a competition on more tournaments that are going to take fighters from that are going to see fighters from all over the world competing at the highest level, basically, and it's going to be essentially seen as an alternative to pro fighting. Like maybe in like say 10 years, 20 years, we're going to see a fighter that is never going to turn pro, that's just going to become, I don't know, a gold medalist at MMA, and that's just going to be his career. That's just going to, that's it.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting. I think it'll be interesting to see how it continues to develop, if it ever makes it to like the Olympics or something like that. Would it kind of be its own thing, or would it be like, should amateur MMA be like its own branch, kind of like that, or should it be on like developing people for the pro game? And maybe you can coordinate both of those things together. I mean, boxing doesn't seem to be that way. You know, like when you see amateur fighters, like, how will his style translate to the pro rules? But they have different scoring system, and the sport is a little different. Whereas if you keep it, I guess, the same, maybe you could coordinate both of those paths. I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see how it happens.
Yeah, it's kind of the main problem is reconciling the general, like the very nature of MMA is that MMA is noisy. There's just so much noise there's so many techniques you can employ. There's so much stuff you can do. And that's why we sort of see this, the general trend used to be is that you compete in another sport for however many years, get good at it. And let's say that's something like wrestling, something like kickboxing and boxing. And then you transition to MMA, having had that experience fighting in another combat sports and competing in other combat sport. But yeah, I mean, it would make sense if amateur MMA stayed as a sort of like a stepping stone where you kind of use it as a way to just grow as a fighter before you, and develop as a fighter and mature as a fighter before you get into pros. But yeah,
I'll
but
just
not
add
even
that.
sure. Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
Just real quick, I just want to say, I'll just add that, like, to get that prestige that you spoke to, and everybody here kind of spoke of, is that I think the incentive can't just be for the amateur to be like, I want to get this title, which is important. It's the martial arts spirit. But I think the promotions and the pros and then the other side waiting for it also has to value that. Like, kind of what Jose said, being able to market that. And you can do that to varying degrees. But I'll just say this, that, like, I wonder if we'll get a shift of what could help make that more important. Not just the centralization that we're obviously talking about, but a weird key here is, like, I'm 36, and I feel like martial artists or fighters around my age or older, that's where you'll see, like if I told you guys I had a black belt in karate and taekwondo, it's like, well, you grew up in the 90s. That's when, it was dominant. And I feel like we're seeing a lot less of that. Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belts will probably be like the last to go, right? Because they're still somewhat relevant, although there are different schools of thought as far as the no-gi. A lot of fighters remain purple belts their whole career. It's not a coincidence. It's because the other training takes them away from things, right? So I wonder if we see a retraction of traditional martial arts, traditional ranks even, and follow suit if these MMA accolades become more valuable to not just the fighter, but the promotion themselves, if that makes sense.
what's also interesting is that it's probably like, provided it develops in the correct way, it's just going to get more people into MMA and just sort of increase the overall talent pool. More people will become interested. Oh, I just can, like, people will start putting kids into training MMA as opposed to training, like, say, wrestling or boxing or any other individual sport. So that's through sheer numbers that would just maybe increase the actual skill levels, the skill ceiling we see in MMA, and maybe we'll see a shift away from, let's say, these this meta where, in order to win fights, many MMA fighters just develop a style that gets them hurt more often, like hyper aggressive styles that are just offensively based, that are based on non-stop offense. But hard to predict. I mean, it's a cool style. Not gonna lie.
I'm here for a fun time, a long tab.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose we've been able to hit on most points that we had, that I've intended to raise, but of course, obviously, there's much more questions about this whole thing that still needs evaluating, and sort of like some research needs to be done. Like, for example, like the prospect of MMA becoming an Olympic sport. That's a whole other can of worms. If you look at the Olympics, the way the Olympics have been set up for years on end, so many corruption scandals all over the place, constantly judging scandals, bribe scandals, all that stuff. And if MMA becomes an Olympic sport, we're gonna have to deal with that as well. So, I mean, I guess we could sit here and talk about it for ages, but I'm assuming you guys have places to be, things to do. But
something like that.
yeah. So
This
I guess
is a good convo.
thank you for this discussion, everyone. And before you go, like, any closing statements, any ideas on how would you like to see amateur MMA develop, or just some concluding thoughts? I guess let's start in the same order that we started. Zach, let's go with your closing statement.
I mean, I would just reiterate kind of, I think the bigger national and global kind of shows seems to be a better way to handle amateur MMA than it currently is. And I mean, I don't have experience in it, but I would say for my guys, I still think they should take the goal should be to develop your skills so you can perform under whatever circumstance, and whatever path is going to help you get there is what I think you should follow, depending on what's available to you. So, but yeah, I hope it becomes an Olympic sport. I hope these these like global amateur programs continue to grow. Yeah, that's it, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Jose.
For me, I just believe people should get as many amateur fights as possible, especially if you're young. I want people to know as amateurs that this is something they seriously want to do. Whether it's going through the injuries, whether it's going through the money sacrifices, or traveling to train and doing this, doing that, because there's a lot of things behind the scenes that we have to sacrifice just to become professionals, nonetheless high class champions and world stars. So it's a process, but the amateur ranks don't just help build up your accolades and your experience, but also teach you the outside stuff or behind the scenes of like, do I really want to do this? This is something I'm going to put in 100% of my time for, because it is a very difficult sport. But then also being able to fight safe enough, being able to find the coaches that are appropriate to you. Again, I've had people corner me that I'm like, no, that's never going to happen again. And I've had people go, man, I can't wait to have you back. So it's finding the right team for you. I've been to multiple gyms. Now I'm staying with Dean. I might be somewhere else next year. You never know. So it's being able to find what's right for you during that moment, and then finding the right team, right, finding the right family, and being able to push in your career. So there's so many things with MMA, with amateur wise, but if you're able to do it, why not have some fun and enjoy it while it lasts? So do you think?
Trey, as an active amateur fighter that is in the beginning stages of his career, what do you have to offer?
Well, no, I like the discussion. It was a very good discussion. A lot of nice perspectives. I guess from my thing, the main thing that I see is that the pro game is very interlinked with the amateur game. I do really like the ideas of like a big nationwide like amateur system, I guess I could say. I like the fact that like having a recognized system instead of just like being everything ragtag from like Texas to wherever else to wherever else to wherever else, being just completely different. But no, yeah, like unfortunately, it's not like that right now. Amateur scenes are different everywhere and are different depending on the country, state, wherever. And you kind of have to navigate it how you have to navigate it within where you're at, which I guess is an unfortunate thing. But again, the discussion was really good. Opened my eyes to a lot of different things, and it was nice.
Dan?
Yeah, I agree. As far as you got to navigate where you're at. The information is out there. The opportunities, as far as opportunities to fight, places to train to fight, they are catching up. Again, not all places are as lucky as others. But even if you are lucky, air quotes, and you're in a big gym, air quotes, in Las Vegas, fight capital, it still doesn't matter until we get some more centralization, so we know what we can prepare, or what coaches can prepare their fighters for. And I'll just add that just no matter what your goal is, whether you're doing it for experience, you want to give yourself the best chance to become a pro, whether you want to be an amateur champion, or you're like me, you're just some like schlep that wants to just test himself, and for whatever personal reasons, you should treat it with the same respect as if you are going to be pro, which sounds obvious. You should respect what you're doing, and not that the proverbial you out there doesn't. What I mean by that is that, take like Treyvon said, a lot of amateurs will still take the 2 to 3 months because this is their time to, prepare like a pro, but also just prepare yourself as in who you have around you. There are some coaches that'll just let anybody fight amateur. You can see that with some of these matchmaking, we used to have that problem back in my day, or if you're, like to cite my own experience, if, your coach, sets you up to fight a person, and he used to coach that person's dad and work at with that person's head coach and have a working relationship with their gym, and they mysteriously don't show up on fight night. For you're like, oh wait, I'm that guy. Oh crap, how did I not see this coming? So you got to be careful. In other words, it can happen to you. No. I guess what I'm trying to say is you want someone to be truthful to you. You don't want someone that's going to baby you or just let you to fight, because not many people, if not anybody, are going to share your motives, whether it's a small goal like mine or a big goal. Almost everybody you meet in this industry is not going to share your goal. So it's important to surround yourself with a good support system. Kind of like Jose says, he's really experienced. He's been around. And right now he's got a really good situation. He's got a real smart guy in his corner, Din Thomas. He's still, like he said, he's he can go do his jujitsu here. And this, like, the resources and the information's out there. It's just how you want to apply it and making sure you have a good support system, because it's quite the road.
Yeah, I guess that about sums it up. I suppose, Jose, you said you've had until 5, I think, that to record this one. So I guess
No, it was actually till 4, but yeah, I was. Yeah,
sorry.
No, you're perfectly fine, man.
Sorry about that, but either way, it was a real pleasure to have you on. If you gotta go, just please don't let me hold you up any longer.
Well, I appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much for the time, and I can't wait to hopefully do another one.
Yeah, as if you have the time, we're going to continue this conversation. There's still lots of things we have to touch upon. I think lots of things to be discussed. Yeah, and it's going to be a real pleasure to have you back on. Thank you.
For sure. Next time, guys. I gotta go. Take care of yourself.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks,
See you, pal.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So I guess we've hit on most of the stuff that I wanted to cover, to just sort of like give an intro to the overall topic. So if it's okay with the rest of you guys, I think we may join up for a follow-up discussion for a part 2 of this discussion. I think there's still lots of things to cover, lots of ground to cover, but overall today, I think we've gotten a bit of a glimpse into how amateur MMA works today. Saying this for the listeners, of course, not for you guys. You already understood you already understand all this stuff, but either way, hope this was an enjoyable listen for everyone listening, and for more discussions like this, for more long form discussions like this, subscribe to the Fight Side Presents channel. Check out our website where we post our articles, and check out the Fight Side Podcast Network for any of our podcasts where we discuss more stuff like this, and also weekly MMA breakdowns. Check out the main channel, check out our Patreon, lots of stuff on there. Dan, please, if you have any plugs, plug away. Plug all our holes.
Oh, geez. No, speaking of that, now you just find me at Dan Tom MMA for my stuff. All my stuff's there, and I'll just turn the plug around and say, yeah, subscribe to the Fight Sites Patreon, because it's one of the only Patreons that'll give you bathhouse fight scene breakdowns, folks. That's right. The content you've been asking for. Thank you, Ed. So I'll just plug that. That was a great piece of content. Props to whoever suggested that.
Yeah, and also while we're at it, I've recently recorded a podcast with Conor Rebush of Heavy Hands that has to do with fighter personalities and how personalities affect fighting styles. It's just us prattling on about armchair psychology the whole way through. I guess you'll enjoy that if you enjoyed this piece of content. And check out Dan's stuff right back at you, Dan. And Trey, any plugs that you would like to have, like would like to do? Also follow Trey on Twitter. I think it's just.
I would really recommend to not do that, man. Mainly because Twitter is a terrible place. Like, don't be on Twitter, please.
So you don't condone Twitter, is what you're saying?
I don't condone Twitter, man.
I mean, wise.
Even though I'm on it, but still.
Very wise.
I'm gonna be the nice person and plug everybody else's stuff. Listen to Tuman's podcast. All his podcasts are great. Tinker Dome, all the Fight Site stuff. Listen to Dan's podcast, all the stuff Dan does. I think Protect Your Neck podcast, right? Is that it, right?
Yeah.
Correct.
Yes, sir. Yes, thank you.
Watch Zach's fights. I've been watching Zach's fights for years, so you should do it. If I'm doing it, you should do it. But no, that's about it.
Any news about upcoming fights? Any upcoming fights?
Hopefully something soon. Like I say again, average is different. You know what I mean? I gotta wait like months for fighs and all that. It's not the same as
I think there's
other places.
I think there's actually footage of you fighting, isn't there? That you may want to direct some people towards, just sort of to check out your fighting style and all that stuff.
I think I have fights on YouTube, but I'm not sure. Like, I think they're like unlisted links or whatever. Just if you can type in my name, hopefully something cool will pop up. Maybe not. It's whatever. But no, yeah. I think the fights are on YouTube, but like again, they're unlisted links. Like they're like, for those of you who upload videos or don't know how it works, like it's like only the like, if you can only watch it if you like are the owner or like send the link itself.
Yeah. So Zach, any upcoming content for the fight site that you would like to announce?
Just this one.
Any
No,
future announcements?
Pleasure being on with you guys. Yeah, I don't have any scheduled fights or anything. I'm teaching. I'm now like running the MMA program here at Finishers MMA in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So dealing with some amateur fighters now, some pro fighters, and I'm still gonna fight. I'm just waiting on that. I know Torres will have his semifinal bout in the Brave Flyweight tournament. I don't know if it's scheduled yet, but it should be coming up fairly soon. He's fighting Ali Bagatinov, and the winner will face the guy that I just beat, who got the decision in the finals. So
Robbery.
I'll plug Shorty's next fight because that'll be a good one. Him and Bagatinov should be a really good one.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to watch your Brave fights, where can they find them?
I think depending on what country you're in, it's different. In the US, you have to go through the Fight app, and then you could just search, like, my last one was Brave 50. I think the event's free, so you can just go watch the whole event for free. The last couple events they've done are free. The earlier ones were like $15 pay-per-view, streaming pay-per-view or whatever. But I think the last bunch are free. So
yeah, and the rest is just on Fight Pass and on Bellator, right?
the UFC fights will be on Fight Pass. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't
So
know where to find Bellator fights, to be honest.
if
It was a long time ago.
if everyone wishes to have a great time and just has some time to kill, just go back and watch Zach's fights. A great fun.
Paul in the house.
Yeah. So I think that's enough of that. Great fun having you. Great fun having you on and talking to you guys. Always some interesting insights. Trey, I would like to have you back for part 2 if we figure out the schedule. I think we will. I think we managed just fine with this one. Right, not gonna take up any more time from you guys. Just right.
Get some sleep, Iggy.
Yeah,
I know, for real.
Yeah, I feel like I'm gonna pass out. I'm just rambling right now.
Yeah.
You need a sign off, Izzy. That's what you need. You need
I know, right?
Yeah, I'm just trying to come up with
off.
I'm trying to come up with a funny way to sign off, but I mean, I guess fuck it. That's the end. Go away. Show's over. All right, let's go. Goodbye.